Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Comply with PCI DSS Firewall Requirements, tips for the upcoming shopping season. We're going to be starting in, I'd say exactly 3 minutes from now. So for those of you that are as timely as Dan and I both are, we appreciate it, but you can feel free to go run and grab a cup of coffee or water. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. In that time though, I'm going to launch a poll. It's kind of just for fun, but if you guys want to fill it out, I'll summarize the results before we kind of get into it, and we'll leave it till then. So we're starting in about another 2.5 minutes. All right, so the poll is now live. Those of you that are here and would like to participate, you can. It's certainly optional, but quick question on how long does your PCI audit usually take? We've heard it from all across the spectrum, so it'd be interesting to kind of summarize results to all those in attendance today, obviously given the relevance of the topic at hand. All right, and let's start to get underway here. I'll leave the poll open a little bit longer, but it looks like, based upon preliminary results, that about half the folks in attendance tend to clear out their external PCI audit in a matter of a few weeks. Actually, we had a little bit of a shift. So that's pretty much break even. Folks are able to do it in just a few days, same amount 2 weeks, and months. No one has said it never seems to end. So for those of you in attendance that managed to complete it just a few days, feel free to chime in here on the best practices. Maybe at the end we can even share them with those folks in attendance if you feel like there's something that we've missed in kind of our overview. Let's move right along here. So today's webinar is How to Comply with PCI DSS Firewall Requirements, Tips for the Shopping Season. My name is Dan Rowe. I'm a Product Manager of Security Solutions at Tufin. I'm joined by my colleague Dan Roberts. He's Lead Sales Engineer here at Tufin. We worked together for a number of years now. We're going to really kind of quickly intro both Dan and I, why we're kind of comfortable sharing this information, where a lot of it came from, and how we hope that you folks can use it too, and then open it up for Q&A. That being said, if you guys have questions as we go through the material, please do feel free to enter it. I believe there's a questions from audience box that you can put in, and we'll try to answer it if it's contextually relevant. If it's not, we might save it to the end. But we will try to get back to everyone individually, even if we can't in the broader appeal. So, Dan Roberts, are you on the line?
I am. Hello,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us, Dan. So I was talking to Dan a little bit before this. Although Dan works with myself at Tufin and has for a number of years in the sales engineering capacity, I think the metaphor is Dan has seen how the sausages are made. He's worked at a number of different organizations, including FedEx, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase. So a lot of those, if not all of them, held financial regulatory mandate requirements, right, from a compliance perspective. I joined TUFIN from prior work at a number of different software companies, one of which was a penetration testing company where we were a qualified security auditor. So my team and I would be brought in support of the penetration testing requirements of PCI. So basically, premised by our experience and a lot of what we're kind of exposed to through TUFIN, we wanted to take this opportunity to provide some insight. Some of that is kind of relevant to that which we do. We also hope a lot of it is outside of that scope as well. For those of you that are unfamiliar with TUFIN, simply because Dan and I both work for TUFIN, we wanted to provide some context there. At this point, I think it's fair to say we're a mid to, I guess I wouldn't say large size software company, but founded back in 2005. We have over 500 employees, and about over half of the Fortune 50 use our products in-house in support of compliance and network security. At the bottom there, you can see a number of different accolades we've received in the last few years. So we've drawn from a lot of information to kind of generate a lot of the content that we're presenting to you today. One of the most recent Verizon Payment Security Report, I think the 2019 one, is still pending kind of their approval and publishing. But a lot of the content we're going to be covering today is PCI security standards. We also have an opportunity to interact and interface with a lot of leading financial institutions for customer advisory meetings, and to that point, actually, if we have any attendants today that would be interested in participating in the future, feel free to drop me a line after the webinar. We'd love to have you participate. And also, of course, based upon our own experience as well. I will call attention because we're kind of going through best practices rather than taking a deep dive into the nitty-gritty and kind of a line-by-line kind of alignment to compliance. I will call attention to an attachment that we have to the webinar today, which is a more, we'll say, iterative and intensive approach in a granular fashion towards PCI best practices for firewall admins out there. And you'll see that kind of linked off to the side of the presentation. So feel free to access it. It's not behind a paywall or anything. So I think the kind of leading or jumping right into it, the most important thing that we see organizations try to achieve and struggle with is segmenting the network. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the idea of segmenting your network, effectively what you're doing, you're grouping IPs or security groups or subnets, common interfaces into what we kind of call a zone. And that zone, you could then say, could only speak to other zones based upon specific services, or would not be able to speak to specific zones through specific services or ports, or other parameters such as, rules that haven't been hit in 90 days, for example. And effectively, it allows organizations to kind of more neatly organize their network. Typically, it's done primarily for achieving speed improvements within the network, but it also obviously aligns to compliance, which is important in the context of PCI, because we don't want to have just a flat network in PCI, because it means the entire network is in scope. And when we talk about risk aversion, we want to avoid having more kind of subject to PCI regulatory mandates and consequent penalties. We want to minimize it to the best of our ability. It also provides the ability to, in some ways, create more manageability for network teams in terms of how they kind of onboard and offboard, assets, whether they're servers or individual computers or applications into zones. But also creates complexity for attackers, because if we're creating logical barriers between zones, we're effectively creating complexity within it. Compromising one part of the network doesn't provide immediate access to other parts of the network, especially through risky services, right? We're going to require multiple pivot points across the network too. One of the ways that we see organizations effectively do this is typically using IPAM. It's probably going to be most relevant towards larger companies out there where they have a lot of onboarding and offboarding of individual addresses in their network, and a lot of fluidity too, right? Especially with reliance on public cloud. I think it's also relevant to consider the concept of containers, because they are generally pretty abstracted from security's purview, despite the fact that they are now typically utilized in most financial organizations, but they need to be accounted for in the context of kind of a compliance benchmark. And when we talk about kind of compliance benchmarks, the opportunity to kind of segment your network is also going to be reliant upon your ability to establish the benchmarks for acceptance and access between these zones, right? So for those of you in attendance today that have read through PCI time and time again, we know that we have technical prescriptions, right? Certain services are permissible between zones. Certain zones should never connect to one another, right? Our cardholder data environment shouldn't connect directly to the internet. We have these in hand. So when we talk about segmenting the network, we have the opportunity to kind of reflect the policies and technical prescriptions of PCI within that. And we'll show some examples later on, how this typically tends to get visualized. But I want to turn it over to Dan. Dan, any comments here on segmenting your network, how organizations are looking to implement that to achieve PCI compliance?
Well, Dan, it really comes down to logical versus physical segments, and they can be one or the other. And you'll see as we move forward here, when we start to get into to talk a little bit about product, how we can achieve that view into those network segments and allow us visibility into what is allowed and what isn't allowed between those network segments. Once we have that down and we know what those zones are, that's really how we can move forward to maybe look at access requests, whether it be manual or automated requests, through these network zone segments that we're going to be building, and allow them to act as kind of our guardrails for PCI compliance. Does that help, Dan?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Dan.
Okay.
And I realize it sounds as though we're in an echo chamber with both of us named Dan, but really we've been through this before. I think secondly, the other important thing, and kind of all can acknowledge, especially those that have been working within financial institutions for a long time, really any sort of organization that has an audit, is that every organization is going to fail an audit somewhere, right? Now, the severity of failure will obviously vary, right? And in some ways, that may just result in a recommendation and make some small changes. In more extreme cases, we're talking about financial penalties. But typically, what happens is those more extreme examples are when organizations inadvertently fall out of compliance, right? The problem is the general sense of uncertainty. Organizations tend to be more reactive to auditing, and if there's a sense of internal acknowledgement that, hey, we are going to have problems with our network, some of those are probably even necessary for the business, right? We are going to permit risky access, and we have to do so because we need to be able to process payment information, dependent upon, or that leverages a legacy application that is inherently vulnerable and requires, risky access. We need to make sure that we have that documented, right? Because when auditors come and they identify it, if we have the business justification for it, we're in a much better position to substantiate the case for that, right? The important part here when we're talking about the understanding of where we have security risks is designating the two examples. One would be one that we wouldn't know about, which would be a violation, which we'd want to figure out how to disposition appropriately, right? We'd either want to eliminate it from our environment or say, hey, we actually do need this for the business. We need to make sure we have the entirety of the appropriate documentation, so that way when auditors do come, we can substantiate it. But also, most important, from a security perspective, we can track it too, right? We have a known risk within the business. It is known to the business, which is also important because it kind of distributes the accountability, beyond just security, right? The business has acknowledged and taken ownership of the fact that they are going to tolerate this degree of risk. So in the event that something unfortunate were to happen, security is not pinned on this one. And we're going to be able to kind of track it too, right? So how often do we want to check in and either recertify that, which says that we need to keep it for the business, or do we want to eliminate it because it's no longer needed? And this is going to be an important facet for making sure we have kind of overall, healthy policy in addition to compliant policies. Dan, it sounds like you got something to add here.
Yeah, and that's really the key. It's just the added visibility to see what's going on, track changes, being able to see who's doing what and where, and that's what audit's really looking for. And if we can provide an easy way to give that information over to the auditors, that just speeds up the process that much better. So again, we're looking at increased visibility, what's changing with rules, when it's being changed, and who does the changes.
And I think the other important aspect here too is knowing that there's probably going to be some surprises, but trying to preempt them too, right? So the more information that we can gather beforehand and incorporate means that we're going to have a lot less surprises in an audit, which I think is kind of the ideal scenario too. You don't want to have something entirely unexpected come through. What are the third best practices? And this is, I think, pretty heavily dictated by PCI. I should have mentioned it earlier too. We kind of correlated some of the different controls of PCI off to the right in orange boxes for those of you that kind of wanted to figure out where our commentary is correlating to. I don't want to go into individually just because typically in presentations for reading off the screen, mine start to melt a little bit. But you can feel free to reference that if you haven't already been doing so before. The change model is critically important. I didn't think you just mentioned that, Dan, because if we have an agreed to process, it means that everything is consistent, and obviously PCI calls for that. And it's important not only from a compliance perspective, but also a security perspective too. And I'll give you an example here. If you have an agreed to change management process, an access request comes in, and it goes through all the appropriate steps from review, design, implementation, and you probably have a couple other security checks in there, whether it be vulnerability information, different kind of security controls aligned to different teams that may have access to different sets of information or different tools that need to weigh in, or even managerial acceptance or approval. That all needs to be documented, right? And if we're kind of consolidating that information in a consistent process, it makes it very easy to substantiate that processes are being followed, but also more importantly, identify when there are out-of-band changes or out-of-process changes. And I'll give you an example that I've seen before and I read about quite a bit often now too, is that organizations will find that someone has reconfigured a device in their network. And typically it means that there's been a successful breach in the network where access to a router has been gained, and either default administrative username and password are there. They're able to reconfigure the router and actually provide greater access to the network. And that's a problem. That's also something that's important for PCI. We want to identify if changes have occurred outside of a process, and this can be a big part of any sort of PCI audit. But also most importantly is automate documentation. So I think for a lot of the folks in attendance that found that their audit review processes are taking weeks or months, if you're able to even automate a small part of that for that kind of documentation collection, if you kind of do a quick ROI calculation of how long are we spending in terms of man hours and not only preparation, but the responses to it, what is the typical cost per man hour and how much can I reduce it by through automating it, you might find a pretty compelling use case to either developing your own internal solutions for this or procuring kind of a commercial solution as well. The other important part of the change model too is validating changes, right? So more often than not, if we are reliant upon a whole lot of manual intervention, to err is human, so we're always going to run the risk of misconfiguring something. It's accidental, it's never intentional, but it does tend to prolong processes or give out kind of the false positive in the sense that connectivity is applied even though it's not, which ends up getting bounced back and forth, and quite a bit of finger pointing as well. Dan, any comments here and context for building and enforcing the change model? Dan, did we lose you?
Oh, my only, sorry about that. My only comment, Dan, would be really to automate, is that's the key, is the automation. Because it is such a daunting task to be able to manage this air quotes stuff that we have. And without some sort of automation to be able to track changes at least to the environment for just to be able to report on when the changes occurred for PCI.
I think it's also a part of assurance too, right? Knowing that you're not necessarily going to have to run through a bunch of different people or try to figure out who an application owner is, for example, right?
Exactly.
You know, knowing that you have all of that in hand is going to end up cutting down a lot of kind of the back and forth, and I think a lot of the overhead of the audit in terms of, you know, time, onus, and constraints as well. All right, so and probably I think what our last point kind of falls into pretty well too is ensuring the integrity of the audit or change trail, right? So as we process the different changes in our network, you know, first and foremost, especially anything related to PCI, we need to make sure that we have documentation. And we need to make sure we have the appropriate documentation too, right? It's not just who did what and when, but we need to make sure that we are very granular in a lot of ways. And this is all, you know, heavily prescribed by PCI too, right? So you make sure that every rule has a comment, every rule has a recertification or expiration date. That's really kind of more of a review date, I think, in PCI terminology. Obviously, nothing egregiously permissive like a triple any rule. No unencrypted services, purpose and explicit use. So, you know, who needs this? Why do they need it? And what's the significance of it? And then from the business perspective, why do we have things deployed in different, you know, environments within our network that generally impose a greater degree of risk and fallout if something bad were to happen? And then obviously the retention of data for a prolonged period of time. You know, Dan, we've got a lot on kind of both sides of the column here. Can you speak to us a little bit about kind of the importance of organizations that you've spoken to in terms of kind of the retention of the data for compliance?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's all part of it is data retention. But you know, just taking a step back to what you see on the screen here is this is really stuff that some firewall vendors will handle, some won't. But and I guess the purpose of this is how can we consolidate all this information into one area and to be able to see it across different types of platforms. And that, again, you know, I don't want to get too much into product, but if we're looking at metadata for each rule that Tufin would add to, say, a given policy, we're going to be able to track everything that's on that you see on the screen, and that's going to handle a lot of what you need for audit, especially when it comes to like rule recertification or comments, or being able to track any rules within the entire environment and not have to log into different firewalls and different firewall vendors' consoles to be able to see it all in one place. This is what we're talking about to assist with the speed of the audit as well as maintaining continuous compliance for PCI.
Right, and I think that's a good point you bring up, Dan, right? The idea of continuous compliance, and I think it's certainly a lofty goal for a lot of organizations, especially when you kind of treat compliance as a you know, wait and sprint mode where we have an audit coming up and we want to kind of stitch everything together that we think might have fallen apart or kind of fallen out of compliance, and then making sure that we are responding to the best of our ability. But I think it kind of harkens back to the first kind of best practices we mentioned, which is kind of that segmenting the network, right? You know, how do we operationalize security policy, you know, within a PCI defined network consisting of multiple zones, and effectively measure our adherence to that? And we're going to really kind of quickly go into how organizations can kind of start to leverage that idea and effectively managing security policies. So at Tufin, we've worked with a number of different analysts and consultancies. You know, the bigger ones you've heard about have all seen this and they've vetted it, as have a great many number of peers as well, of a maturity model for network security policy management. And you know, for us, and I think for pretty much everyone in security, it starts with visibility. The context here is within every organization, we typically tend to find one of two different priorities being applied within the network. One would be agility, right? So organizations that are heavy utilizers of cloud, and maybe security has been partitioned in some ways from kind of the cloud infrastructure administration. They're going to be struggling to effectively apply security, but you'll find that there's a ton of changes, a ton of application development, a bunch of different connectivity that's provided within that kind of virtualized environment and to the internet. And it becomes very challenging because things are basically changing so quickly that security can't necessarily integrate within it. And we have a very quick, rapid pace of development, but one that is kind of exclusive of security. Now, we also have the alternative, which, I think for probably some of the larger pedigreed organizations out there where security has kind of held the reins longer than some of their peers, things tend to be a little bit slower, where we have a very thorough security review process. Security may be brought in towards the end, and we have a change management process that is not necessarily going to enable the business to deploy applications as quickly as they want. But when they do get deployed, we're going to have the greatest assurance that we have the least amount of risk introduced to the business. So what we hope to achieve is kind of the balance between these two, right? And in the context of, probably the larger banking organizations out there, it starts with visibility. So we have a hybrid network. It's inclusive of, public and private cloud, as well as kind of our on-prem infrastructure. It requires an understanding of what that network actually consists of, right? What do we actually need to secure? From the point of visibility, we have the opportunity to clean up items. So I suspect most folks here that have picked up a new job in the last few years didn't build the network themselves, right? You've probably inherited a bunch of policies that someone else have, put into firewalls to provide connectivity without the appropriate documentation. And that becomes very tricky to manage because you don't want to necessarily remove anything that's going to break anything. Without context, you can't necessarily do that. But through automation, what we want to do is provide the ability to query the policies we have and say, all right, what do we have that we need? What do we have that we don't need? What do we have that we don't know about? And how are we going to effectively disposition that? Thirdly, we have the opportunity to achieve analysis and design capabilities. So if we have a network where we have an optimal set of policies, right, only that which we have, we can then start to make changes to that network based upon the premise of integrated compliance. This means that if we've achieved a state of compliance, we can then make changes based upon compliance, which means that we will maintain that state, right? This can be very important for a new organization that is kind of reaching out, trying to achieve that state of continuous compliance, as PCI indicates. The next step would be towards application-driven automation. So how can we effectively ingest the information from application owners without exposing them to the complexities of network and network security, and say, we will handle all the change designs, just provide us the necessary requirements for application connectivity. We'll run the compliance calculations, and we can automate these changes, at least in their design, across the network. And lastly, even provision those changes too. The effective achievement across all of this is a trajectory towards achieving security policy management maturity, right? How do we make changes in an effective way that integrates what's probably most important to the folks here, compliance, which kind of sits in the middle. It's a benchmark that provides both reactive and proactive benefits. Because if we're talking about deploying or operationalizing security policy in PCI environments, it means we're going to identify everything that's there that may not necessarily be inherently risky, based upon whatever our own kind of corporate security policy is, but does violate, PCI compliance and the prescriptions they have. It also means that as we go through introducing changes to the network, we're going to integrate compliance too, which means that if we are going to require access to the network and it is going to violate compliance, at least we can disposition it as an exception. So that way we're not getting false positives, but we also know that it's there so that we can track it and remove it. I think a lot of the times when folks talk or ask us about segmenting the network, and we talked a lot about operationalizing security policy, sometimes visuals are kind of the most helpful. And so if you take a look at your screen, this is how we at Tufin do it. This is actually kind of indicative of how a lot of our clients were doing it for a while before we built this, working alongside them. But effectively, it allows organizations to design zones. And typically, I think that's probably done in like a Microsoft or an Excel sheet. Sometimes it's in people's heads. But the ability to kind of design the appropriate categorization of different assets into zones, so that way the assets of commonality can kind of share the appropriate security policies and how they should be applied to them, and then you can effectively deploy how things should or should not connect. And you could go for a whitelist or blacklist approach. But it effectively allows you to at least have a security policy, which I think is most important for most organizations because, and I'll challenge those in attendance today, I would be curious how many folks here could actually reference something that says what can connect to what and how and for how long and through what services. Because I think when it comes down to going through audits, providing some sort of visualization of technical content, for which auditors are not necessarily technical, can be very helpful in helping them understand kind of the state of compliance or what compliance looks like within the environment. And obviously, there's different ways to do that, and it requires having the ability to layer a lot of these too. Because if you're PCI compliant or required to be PCI compliant, you might also be a hospital, and you might have healthcare records or energy companies too, right? I mean, they have to process credit card payments. So I actually wanted to hand it over to Dan to kind of talk through some of the different ways that TUFN supports this, because we had a couple questions actually before this on Twitter on how we can enable it, and then we'll open up for Q&A at the end. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, Dan, I'm going to just take one step back just to talk a little bit more about the establishing zones and how that is inherent in the TUFN product. And what we're talking about here is our unified security policy. And from these, again, Dan said, we can layer this based on, security posture on top of all our compliance needs. So what you see here in front of you is really how we segmented this lab environment into PCI zones so that we could block traffic, allow traffic, and we're not actually doing the blocking or allowing, but we're seeing where that is occurring within the current environment. Now, what we do with these matrices is, after we layer it on the current policy, track our violations, we can also use that as our, I like to call them guide rails or guardrails, but they will be our guardrails for any new access requests coming in, because we're going to compare this matrix to that new access request to see if it's in compliance or not. If it's not in compliance, it's thrown out, or it's handled as an exception. So that's how we handle this within a workflow, within the workflow capabilities, to do our risk analysis upfront before a rule is ever provisioned to the firewall. That gives us our reactive approach to what our PCI policy is. If I go forward here one screen, then we're talking about our violations and what is violation. Again, this is coming from existing policy. We compare that matrix and we get a list of all the devices and what the violating policy is on those devices. And I think the next screen will show us a little bit a view of what a violation. No, this one is a policy browser. But we could get a view of and drill in a little bit on each of the devices that'll show us exactly how to mitigate that violation. So again, that's our reactive approach to our current policy by using that matrix, and then using that matrix as well moving forward as a reactive approach to policy. Those two things, and that USP is one of the main functions of TUFN. And again, this is how we move forward into a zero touch, that we're using these USPs as our guardrails to keep within compliance. We have another product. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of product stuff, but we have another product called Secure App, which really tracks applications and not necessarily the network underpinnings of the application, but we're more concerned about connectivity of the application itself. We can also track those applications, and as we make changes to those applications, there's a button right on the screen that says continuous compliance. We hit that button, and that's going to tell us where that application is in violation before it's ever processed into the network infrastructure. So all these things around compliance and PCI and our security posture as an organization all happen and is all inherent within the Tufin product, and really the reason why we exist. This gives us a little view of our policy browser. Again, a view into the database of all policy across all devices that we want to envision. We can pull out just violations for PCI within this view, so we're able to report on everything that would be in violation. And again, we use the metadata for each and every rule. This is not something that would show up on the firewall, but only shows up within the Tufin framework. Let's move forward here. I just have a few just product slides. Again, this is showing us the policy browser and how we can see different violations within the metadata itself, and how the policy would look, just one rule off one device. And this is what I was looking for earlier, but this would actually show the list of violations for a device, and we can see compliance here. So in this first instance, we have this rule that we're looking at is an any rule, and this violates of course our PCI compliance that we put in for that particular rule.
I think it's important to note too, Dan, right? When we're talking about configuring kind of security policies or what the desired state of compliance is, it's also important to understand there's different severities, right, in violations. So, for example, I think one against PCI would be ranked as critical, whereas maybe one on internal best practices might be a little bit lower. But when we talk about kind of layering security policies, I'd be surprised if an organization just has to adhere to PCI compliance. So it's important to note that, when you are investing in some sort of compliance product, whether you're building it yourself or buying it, you're going to want to make sure that it's inclusive of more than just kind of, whatever the initial search parameter of, compliance is, right? I think it's something that's important for organizations to also figure out how to effectively disposition violations and prioritize them effectively. Sorry for jumping in, Dan.
No, that's fine, Dan. The other thing that we can do with Policy Browser too is if you have an audit coming up, and because you're maintaining continuous compliance because you're using the USPs, it's really just a matter of the auditors show up, we hand them a report, or we give them login credentials for Tufin and let them have at it. We know that we're in compliance because we're maintaining our USPs, and we're looking at using those USPs to automate any changes. So there's really no manual input on an issue that would occur, and then the auditor would just have to look at really just exceptions on what was out of the guide rails and why did you put it into play. And if we have that covered, then we're gonna pass the audit with flying colors. Okay. Yeah, I mean, anybody that is on the call that does want to see the product, of course, get with your sales rep, and we'd be glad to get you a little deeper dive into what Tufin can and can't do for PCI compliance. We looked at that view there. So this really, with this slide, we're really just showing how some steps of a workflow. And this could be really with the baked-in security and compliance. As we walk through the steps, we're going to have automated steps to do that risk assessment that I said. So we're comparing that matrix to the task or the user access request to be able to automate that risk assessment piece and let us know up front if we're in compliance or not. Then again, as I said, we're comparing the matrix to the access request, so we know again if it is in violation. We can also automate the design process from that access request within the workflow itself. So we not only do the risk assessment, but we're also looking at network topology to see where changes need to be made and on what devices within the network. We can do this analysis up front so the user can see that path and know what needs to be changed, or even if something needs to be changed before the change even occurs. And we can also print out the output of the risk assessment to the user as well, and that can all be automated within the workflow design. And then, of course, there's automated provisioning steps. So we want to push the change that the user wants out to the firewalls, and we have a process now to automate that change and automate that provisioning to the end devices. And we support pretty much every major firewall vendor out there. So we can do this with also on the API side to do some of the provisioning as well. But this would make the changes out to the management console of the firewall vendors that we're using. And we see just a sample view of what our designer tool would look like when we do automated provisioning, and it really breaks down by device, by vendor, what the changes are and how the change is going to look prior to the push being made. We call it automated accelerated implementation. And then lastly, of course, full accountability. If it's authorized or unauthorized change, if it happens out of band from TUFIN, it will come in as an unauthorized change. This is an auditing process or an auditing tool that we can actually see if changes happen that weren't authorized. If they are an unauthorized change, we have the ability to go in and either authorize it or explain why it's unauthorized. Again, giving us that audit trail of anything that happens within the environment. All right. You know, I think one thing I did not touch on before we get to Q&A is rule recertification. And I probably should have put a slide just specific to rule recertification. This has become a very interesting feature for TUFIN, because this is something that also that banks have recently just jumped on. And what we're doing is really keeping a database within our metadata of rule recertification. When rules expire, who the business owner is. We can even script to the business owner when a rule expires, what do you want to do with it? Do you want to recertify it, decertify it, or remove it? And based on his response, we can automate that process to either recertify it or decommission the rule. So there's a lot of things that can happen for just that, around that rule recertification process. And the only way to change the database is through a workflow. And now we have a real good process for rule recertification. And that really has come up recently, I would say within the last year and a half, especially with bigger banks around rule recertification, and they've all wanted to now implement new processes just around rule recertification. So we give you that capability and that option within the product itself. So if anybody is interested in that, please get with your TUFIN sales rep, and we can go through the rule recertification process. I did want to mention that. So, yep.
Yeah, no, and thank you for doing so. I was going to say, I think the other offer we have here beyond the kind of the content that we've provided or attached to this is earlier we kind of covered the network security policy maturity model. And if organizations are interested in having an assessment done, that's something that we can do. It's again, not product specific, but we can work with you guys to define where you are from a couple different perspectives, which generally helps out with some degree of decision making and where technical investments are going to go, moving forward. So that is basically free consulting, and that doesn't happen all that often. So if folks had that resonate with them, you can feel free to drop us a line. You can see where to do so in front of you. One is Twitter, one is our website. I'm also active on Reddit, So if anyone else is as well, you can find my handle too, and Dan, you can feel free to message me there in addition to my own Twitter handle. Dan, we have some time for questions, and we have, I think, 2 already. Folks can feel free to enter them in as well. First one, maybe I can field, Dan, and you can feel free to add to as well. Do you need to have a different workflow for access requests to PCI environments and or PCI covered environments, I think? And to that, the answer is really no, right? Because if you have a compliance benchmark integrated, we're going to determine whether or not there is a compliance issue within it, and we're going to calculate that. So it wouldn't necessarily require a different workflow. Dan, would you agree with that statement?
I would agree. I would agree, Dan. However, if there is particular PCI needs, or you have separate requirements internally that you need a separate workflow just for PCI, we can certainly develop a second workflow. But it would be inherent in any user access request anyway, as long as we have a matrix built around PCI compliance.
And we have another question. Does Tufin integrate with any other compliance products? Probably, I'll try to handle it, Dan. Maybe you can chip in here too. Yeah. We do have a bunch of supported integrations. We didn't necessarily cover it in terms of the different vendors we support, but all the major firewall and cloud providers we have support for. We also have the ability to support kind of generic devices, those which don't fall underneath our direct support within topology, which helps out with path calculations and compliance as well. In addition to a bunch of other ecosystem integrations, and some of that is through our support through our TAP program, which supports a number of different vulnerability management providers, IPAM solutions, SOAR products for talking about kind of security incident response. In addition to those which can be integrated, Tufin itself is an integration product. You wouldn't necessarily buy it by itself. You buy it because you have so many other tools as well. So there are a ton of different tools, I think, typically used environments, and any of those that could leverage topology, compliance, or change management can be integrated in Tufin. And I haven't found really any exceptions to that. Dan, would you agree with that statement?
Yeah. I would agree with that, and really, keep this in mind. We are a database of policy, regardless of what kind of device it is. What kind of device it is. Now, with that database, you want to do all kinds of things with the data that you have. That's reporting. That could be integration to another tool. So, with the APIs, we give you the ability to transfer data back and forth to really any tool that's out there. And as Dan mentioned, we really haven't found any real limitations yet on what we can and can't interface or integrate with. If the tool on the other side has as robust APIs as we do, I can put it that way.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So we have another question, and I think maybe we can partially answer this. I'm not sure we entirely could. And I'll probably defer to you, Dan, and support as I can. But where does PCI stand with converged and non-converged networks? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know where to go with that one. I mean, that leaves there's a lot of openings. I'd like to understand a little bit more about what you mean by converged and non-converged. And if it's as long as we have a network that's available and accessible by the company, and we're holding that data, then and we're connected into the network with the Tufin box, then of course we're going to be able to run the compliance checks against that network.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a trickier one too, because I think when we're talking about converged networks, we're talking about a lot more than just kind of different services. for example. Where we're starting to talk about products, like, third-party communication products and how they pass information back and forth outside of the services that they use. And that might be further outside, I think, both your and mine, at least immediate and prior experience as well. But I will ask around for the folks that I do know in PCI and see if I can get back to you. We do have a product differentiation question, and we didn't really necessarily get that far into it, so I don't really want to use the time for that, but I will follow up with you individually as well. With that being said, Dan, I think we actually are not out of time, but I think we're at the end of, I think, what we had prepared in terms of comments. So I want to thank you, Dan Roberts, for participating in today's webinar. I appreciate the insight that you shared.
Thank you for
and
having
thank you to everyone
Dan.
else that was here.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, always a good time when the Dans get together. And thank you all for participating in today's webinar. We hope to see you in some of the future ones. Cheers.